Okay, the recording has been started.
Okay. Good evening, our viewers in North America, and good morning, our panelists and other viewers in India. We are here yet again once a month for our monthly roundtable discussion of the Council for Strategic Affairs. We have a very lively and interesting topic of geopolitical significance at this point. Before I introduce the topic and our speakers, I'm going to start sharing my screen. So just give me a minute. Okay. So the topic for today's discussion is AUKUS, Quad, and the maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region. And that's a very timely topic at this point in time. A little bit about the Council for Strategic Affairs. Council for Strategic Affairs imparts education in the field of international relations. Council for Strategic Affairs fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. Council for Strategic Affairs, in general, encourages strategic studies to raise the level of awareness. CSA aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity. And lastly, CSA unequivocally condemns all the terrorism in its all forms worldwide. So what are our activities? We have a monthly roundtable discussion on second Monday of each month at 8 p.m. Eastern Daytime. And that is what we are having today. We also have once a month a guest lecture by a distinguished domain expert. Council for Strategic Affairs also organizes symposia, meetings, and conferences. CSA promotes publication of articles on geopolitics and related subjects. And we have a very active Strategic Affairs Google group on which we do certain postings. So while registering for this roundtable discussion, you might have seen this flyer, which features our two distinguished panelists today. And they are Rear Admiral retired Dr. Sanatan Kulshrestha and Mr. Vijay Nilekani. And both are experts in their own rights. I'm pretty sure that you're going to see them, but this is Admiral Kulshrestha, who took the trouble of waking up at 5:30 a.m. to join this roundtable discussion. He's based in Noida, in India. And our second panelist is Mr. Vijay Nilekani, who is a strategic expert, an international businessman who has interest in nuclear industry. So I will introduce both the speakers at this time. Let's start with our first speaker, Admiral Sanatan Kulshrestha. He's a postgraduate in physics from Jodhpur University in India. He served in Indian Army for almost 6 years, from 1975 till his superannuation in 2011. He specialized in quality assurance of naval armament and held various key appointments at the Naval Command Headquarters, DRDO establishments, ordnance factories, and finally rose to become the Director of General Naval Armament Inspections at the Integrated Headquarters of Ministry of Defense and Naval Section. He is an alumnus of the prestigious National Defense College in India. He has a doctorate from the School of International Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He is also an empaneled PhD guide at the Amity University, which is a private university, very famous private university in Noida, UP. He has been engaged in the study of strategic aspects of acquisition of emerging technologies in India by both the public and private sectors and with specific relevance to national security. He also contributes regularly to defense journals on maritime issues and defense technology. Keynote/plenary speaker at various national and international conferences. Now I will introduce our second speaker, Mr. Vijay Nilekani. He holds a BSc in Mechanical Engineering in 1970 from National Institute of Technology, Calicut, Kerala. He got his master's in Industrial Engineering in 1974 from T&M University. He has worked with a number of private businesses, multinational companies, including Mahindra and Mahindra, Canada in USA, Exelon Energy in US, IAC Japan in Washington, D.C., and he worked at Nuclear Energy Institute in Washington, D.C. from 2005 to 2014. His overall career has spanned over 45 years in energy industry, 8 years in oil and gas, 37 years in nuclear energy, and nuclear security policy. His last assignment was as a senior technical advisor on nuclear security for civilian nuclear plants with involvement with lessons learned from Fukushima nuclear accident in 2011. His current interests are energy policy, macroeconomics, geopolitical development, and travel. He is a multifaceted individual with, multiple hobbies and passions. He has traveled in 87 different countries in all the 7 continents. So he is a very well-rounded person. He has spent extensive time living and learning in India, US, Canada, Mexico, South Africa, and Japan. He is truly a citizen of the world. So we have these two giants who will give their geopolitical expertise on this particular topic. Before I bring the speakers, there are some housekeeping rules of the Council for Strategic Affairs. We would like all the viewers to mute themselves to avoid noise interference. We would ask you to change your cell phone setting to vibration mode or even turn it on. Please do not log on multiple devices. There is interference from sound and otherwise. Please do not interrupt our esteemed speakers when they are speaking. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly and turn their video on will be allowed to pose questions. We do not allow anonymous questioners to ask questions. So if you are just giving your cell phone number or something like that, we will not allow you to pose questions. We would like you to send all your questions by chat function. Please be very precise and specific in asking a question. Please do not send a monologue or a lecture in the form of a question. It has to be very precise. We are recording this event and it will be available later on, on our YouTube channel and our Vimeo channel. I will start with our first speaker, who is going to be Admiral Kulshrestha. And before I bring him in, I know he has a PowerPoint, so let me try to load his PowerPoint before I give him the floor. So I have to share this screen now. You can see the screen. Admiral Kulshrestha, the floor is yours. When you want to change the slide, you give me directions and I will change to the next slide.
Can we go to the first slide?
Yeah, first slide is on.
No, sir, this is not the first one.
Okay.
This is the sixth one.
Okay. I am sure. This is the first.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Adityanji. I would like to thank CSA for providing me with this wonderful opportunity to air my views today. I would be talking of a few facts and concepts which may appear a bit disjointed at first, but I am confident that you all will be able to see the whole picture by the time I finish my talk. What I would like to highlight through my talk is how China has imbibed and worked on the very same principles which have made the US Navy the greatest navy on earth. I have also tried to find a way ahead for, for the coalition of democracies utilizing some existing principles and mechanisms. I would request to have a look at the distance and timetable which I have put together to provide you with an insight as to how warships move across the oceans and the time taken for their transit. Next slide, sir. As you can see in the slide, the distance to South China Sea and Japan for China is very, very less. It is in terms of a few hours, whereas for India and US and maybe Australia also the same thing. It is not only hours; it is in number of days. Can we go to the next slide, please? In military operations, the defending party is at an disadvantage. Is at an advantage if aggressor has to transit long distance to carry out attack. Kenneth Polding had articulated the loss of strength gradient principle. He said that in military operations, the further the target for attack is from the home country, the weaker its military strength becomes. Long distance mobilization is not only expensive and time consuming, it also tends to tire soldiers out and weaken their morale as a result of exhaustion. In addition, the further the forces are from home country, the longer the logistic line becomes. Defense capabilities become more depleted and need additional security. These days, the problem of distance is being mitigated to an extent through technological advancements. Advances in mobility, long-range firepower, and digitization of battlefield have reduced the time to target. But Kieran Webb emphasizes that loss of strength gradient still holds, and therefore there is a necessity of forward deployment basis. The main reason being that the same technological advances have accrued to the opponents also. The opponent too can engage the aggressor at a much larger distance and with better precision. Further, it is not sustainable for a major power to keep projecting larger power to overcome distances indefinitely, and therefore it is logical to invest in forward bases and allies. Military operations require a tremendous amount of logistical support. A forward deployment strategy would need a secure, continuous replenishment through cooperation with allies. As a thumb rule, for a successful mission, the power required would be between 3 to 5 times that of the enemy at the point of engagement. Due to loss of strength gradient factor, the forward bases and allies can make up for the loss of power. Mahan asserted that countries that attempt to control important waters that are far away from home country have to secure strategic locations in the aforesaid waters. According to Mahan, strategic locations that are appropriately chosen form bases. Such bases may be of secondary importance when considered from the perspective of their relationship with the home country, but are primary bases in the areas concerned. As per report of the Gulf War 1990-91, US transported 9.7 million tons of supplies by water and air. However, the value of supplies that had been built up on the front beforehand was very high. Three quarters of the 6.1 million tons of fuel was transported from Gulf countries to Northeast Saudi Arabia via United States Marine Transportation Command. The US Armed Forces supplied 2 million gallons of drinking water every day. An estimated 22,000 vehicles were contracted from civilian suppliers within Saudi Arabia. In particular, 1,000 heavy transport vehicles were needed to transport tanks and armored personnel transport vehicles. In addition, the supply of fuel transportation vehicles refrigeration vehicles, bulldozers, trailers, buses, and moving command post vehicles also relied on local leases. Ammunition for the Air Force had already been stored in depots in Oman, Turkey, and Diego Garcia. Other pre-positioned resources in Oman included shelters, tents, generators, and water purifiers. Pre-positioning ships were available in Diego Garcia, and these proved to be of use in providing supplies to the first contingent that was dispatched. These vessels transported 5.5 million gallons of jet fuel, ammunition, 3,000 landmines, machine guns, and mortars. In addition, cranes, refrigeration cars, forklifts, 6,000 sets of sleeping bags, uniforms, washing machines, clothing, cots, blanket, tents, printers, and radios were also transported. Can I have the next slide? Mahan, in his seminal work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, has stressed that the ships need a secure port wherever they visit. Further, the merchantmen need protection from the nation whose flag they bear, especially in times of war. There may be a need to escort the merchant ships using men of war during hostilities. The importance of secure sea lines of communication or the slocks for a nation has become paramount to safeguard not only its trade but also its growing energy needs. The merchant ships today, by and large, do not operate under the home country's flag. The navies are therefore being kept for protection of slocks and projection of soft or hard power. When China embarked upon a path of rapid economic reforms, it became increasingly clear that plan would have to expand to meet the new requirement across the oceans. China therefore embarked upon a phased transformation of its navy into a formidable blue water force, which would, if required, command the seas in times to come. Nearly 120 years after Mahan, China has embarked on the Mahanian path, albeit with a structured way to favor its geopolitical aspirations more than commercial ones. At this juncture, I would like to highlight the linkages between the web of ports under the influence of China and the arms export it does to numerous countries across the globe. May I have the next slide, please? In this quotation, the most interesting thing is the last three lines, which says, and participation in international maritime cooperation and build strategic logistic sites for maritime power. This is from the white paper of PRC 2015. Degang Sun, while writing for Middle East Institute, has brought out that China has two frontiers, namely a natural sovereign frontier and an artificial one as the overseas frontier. The offshore frontier imbibes China's commercial interests and enhances its geopolitical reach as China attempts to assume the role of a global leader. It has adopted the soft and hard military approaches towards artificial overseas frontier. May I have the next slide, sir? The hard approach implies military treaties, setting up of military bases like the one in Djibouti, where it conducts military activities freely, including military exercises, surveillance and reconnaissance operations, and if need be, provide security cover to the host nation. The soft approach includes joint military exercises, patrols, training, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief, medical support, setting up of workshop for arms and ammunition, short-term use of basing facilities, etc. The soft approach is further beneficial if there is a civilian mission in the host country, whereas the hard approach could at times lead to souring of relations. The soft approach appears benign and can be upgraded to a hard approach should both nations so desire. In the past few years, it is seen that Chinese maritime functions have increased manifold with the launching of the Maritime Silk Road and its connect with the One Belt, One Road initiative. The acquisition of interests in ports across the globe by Chinese state and private companies is a direct result of this approach. Ports with interests held by Chinese companies in the Indo-Pacific are, sir, may I have the next slide? As you can see, in Southeast Asia, these are the ports in which the Chinese firms or indirectly the Chinese government has direct interest. It is appropriate to look at some of the arms export data from China to friendly countries. SIPRI Arms Transfers Database released in 2020 reveals that China exported arms and ammunition to 59 countries during the period 2014 to 2019. North Korea is not included in the SIPRI database as no information is available regarding arms purchased by it from China. The type of weapons exported by China during this period comprised of aircraft, air defense systems, unmanned vehicles, armored vehicles, artillery engines, missiles, naval weapons, sensors and chips. Sir, may I have the next slide? In my analysis of ports and arms, it is interesting to note that 41 countries of the 59 countries to which China had exported arms, they have ports on their maritime borders. At least 15 countries out of 41 have known strong Chinese presence in their ports. Further, 9 landlocked countries that received arms and ammunition from China have contiguous boundaries with coastal nations, which in turn are beneficiaries of Chinese arms export. One double landlocked country, Uzbekistan, is surrounded by 6 landlocked countries, out of which 5 are recipients of arms directly from China. May I have the next slide, please? The arms industry is like any other. It operates without regulation. It suffers from widespread corruption and bribes, and it makes its profits on the back of machines designed to kill and maim human beings. This is from Arms Industry Control and Arms Campaign, October 2008. The arms exporting governments indulge in furthering their geopolitical agendas, strategic interests, as well as their economic interests by keeping their own arms industry churning. There is no fair pricing of a particular type of weapon. It is decided upon the need and the hidden agenda of the governments. The arms trade is not only lucrative for the seller, but also for the buyer, as it gives the buyer a sense of building power and security from inimical neighbors. Arms exports are strategic since they involve the national security of a sovereign state. Small nations share their national security concerns and seek advice as to the weapon suites. This in turn makes them vulnerable to China. The weapons ensure at least 2 to 3 decades of dependency through the requirement of workshops, testing equipment, periodic maintenance, supply of critical spares, modifications, mid-life upgrades, future models, and regular supplies of ammunition. A nation cannot get out of these cycles once it has imported a weapon system critical to meet its national security needs. From the arms exporters, such a relationship is the proverbial cow which can be milked for cash and geopolitical influence periodically. Needless to say that with sophisticated weapon system comes the associated burden of exorbitant costs to be met through easy finance from Chinese entities, and thereafter the web of debt track springs shut. Ports are crucial for import-export of arms as they not only provide cheapest mode of transport, but as compared to road and air transportation modes, they permit safe hauling of large tonnage of explosives across vast distances. Thus, for a coastal nation receiving arms to import at her ports, it becomes symbolic long-term relationship with the exporter, even though exporter may not have invested in the recipient's harbor or port. The exporter enjoys a preferential treatment because of the sensitive nature of the cargo. 2 clear categories emerge from the analysis above are as far as the ports are concerned. First, countries which import arms from China, but their seaports are free from any Chinese encumbrance. Secondly, those countries which import Chinese weapons also have some of their ports in partial or full control of Chinese enterprises. These 2 categories of nations have to be strategically freed away from Chinese influence. Only a consortium of countries can carry out this task, which in turn implies creation of a coalition shield against the expansion of Chinese interests in foreign ports. The web of ports and arms has been meticulously spun by China, ensnaring many nations across the globe, and it would be an arduous task to wean the affected nations by providing cost-beneficial alternatives. May I have the next slide? The positioning of China of road and rail mobile anti-ship ballistic missile Dongfeng 21D and Dongfeng 26C in recent past is to put a serious deterrent in place to thwart any intimidating attempt by the US Navy. It is claimed that DF-21D has a range of 1500 kilometers and is armed with a maneuverable re-entry vehicle. The DF-21D has the ability to attack large ships like aircraft carriers. Dongfeng 26 has a claimed range of 3 to 4,000 kilometers, enough to strike the main US base at Guam. It is estimated that China has command control communications, computer intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or C4ISR capabilities required for targeting ships at sea. However, the anti-ship ballistic missiles also require over-the-horizon targeting support that can integrate target information from multiple sources. Once fully deployed, the Chinese ASPM system of systems would be the world's first system capable of targeting a moving carrier with a long-range ballistic missile fired from land-based mobile launcher and would pose a grave threat to Quad forces and bases in the region. May I have the next slide? An idea floated some years back can be adapted by the Quad. It is based upon the fact that the greatest challenges to the US Navy surface fleet and Western fleet are the air, naval, and missile forces of the People's Republic of China, which are supported by a growing array of surveillance and reconnaissance systems. However, China's ability to track and target American surface ship is still relatively distributed. Lethality seeks to exploit this surveillance weakness by putting more targets into combat area, making tracking and targeting a more complex problem. The best way to implement the distributed lethality concept in the Western Pacific is through distributed basing, expanding the number of facilities where Quad surface combatants can be based. However, the ports and base facilities in the region that the Quad would depend on to keep its surface forces in fight would be at the risk, as they would be targeted by Chinese land-based missiles. Next slide, sir. In the above context, acquisition of nuclear submarine technology by Australia as a part of AUKUS is a good step, in my opinion, as it would enable positioning of SSNs and SSBNs for much longer duration in the South China Sea. Further, nuclear submarine base could be utilized by the US and UK SSBNs for maintenance and replenishment while on deployment. The distributed lethality concept does provide a new and potentially effective way for the Quad to respond to anti-access and area denial threats, but more work needs to be done on the logistical side. In order for distributed lethality to be most effective, Quad surface combatants would be distributed at more locations throughout the Western Pacific. This would enable them to get their combat areas faster and would present more targets for Chinese to engage in the early stages of an armed conflict. However, expanding access and distributing surface combatants across more facilities in the Western Pacific will not be easy tasks. Having Quads spread across more facilities will not be beneficial unless those facilities can be adequately defended. Bringing many facilities up to an acceptable standard of protection will require an investment of time and resources that create a window of opportunity for Chinese action. Having the distributed lethality concept would be a good start for the Quad because it shows about new ways to counter the A2AD strategy. However, more thinking on the logistic aspect of the distributed lethality needs to be done in order for distributed lethality to reach its full potential. May I have the next slide, sir? The Japanese peace treaty was signed on September 6, 1951 between 49 allied countries and Japan, which also contained elements of regional security. A separate security treaty was signed between the US and Japan on that day, which made Japan's economy, military, and diplomacy dependent upon the US. There was a slew of bilateral agreements and treaties thereafter, which resulted in a loose and flexible collective security and cooperative structure in the region. The result was a hub and spoke structure with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Philippines, Thailand, and Australia as the spokes and US as the hub. Historian John W. Dower coined the term San Francisco system to describe this informal arrangement under the security umbrella of the United States. The SFS continues to this day in the absence of any formal security structure covering the Pacific region. China has been working on the strategy of casting a strategic net across the seas with its arms sales, which raises security concerns for the nations directly or indirectly dependent upon the sea trade. It has almost put in place a multipolar power structure which would be difficult to dislodge. The Chinese arms sales should not be wished away as insignificant since the market share of US remains undented. It should instead be assessed in terms of collapsing strategic and geopolitical space of the US and its future ramifications. May I have the next slide, sir? The option today. Sir, the slide previous to this one. Yes. Sir. The option available today in the Pacific is striving for freedom of the ocean commons and loosening the trade and economic web spun by China through strengthening spokes in the San Francisco system. It may be worthwhile to look for additional spokes in the nearly 70-year-old system, especially in the island chains. The island chain strategy is a strategic maritime containment plan first conceived by John Foster Dulles in 1951. It comprises of surrounding the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China with naval bases in the West Pacific to project power and restrict sea access. This concept for USA is a part of the force projection, and for China the concept is integral to its maritime security and fears of strategic encirclement by US armed forces. May I have the next slide, please? On an aside, veteran admirals and strategists have put forward many plans to attack China with line of defense beyond the second island chain, confirming that China is well poised to hold the defenses at the first island chain. Island nations with rich maritime heritage offer a good strategic foothold and geostrategic advantage in the Pacific. For example, there are large swaths of uninhabited islands which can be utilized for innovative security infrastructure. With the available sensor technologies and cost-effective ISR, stations can be created which in turn would help in development of South Pacific nations and wean them away from the influence of China. And in these islands, nations offers Quad the flexibility of using existing seaports and airstrips as well as an alternate maneuvering and staging area. In turn, it could accrue scarce strategic space and strengthen the island chains. Thank you, sir. I have finished. Namaskar and Jai Hind. Last year.
That's the last slide, sir. Let me just turn this off. Okay. I must thank you, compliment you for this brilliant scholarly presentation on the challenges of maritime security in the Indo-Pacific in the contemporary, geopolitical scenario. We will have our questions later on. I am going to invite our second speaker for the day, Mr. Vijay Nilekani. I know, Mr. Nilekani, you don't have any PowerPoint at this time, or you do?
I don't have any PowerPoints. I'm going to speak just off my cuff, but I want to make it more a discussion than a presentation. So what I will do is I will highlight the pluses and minuses of the geopolitics of the region, and especially through the prism of Quad and AUKUS and all that. So basically, on the plus side, I'm going to say that there are two choke points where the US currently has a very good, had anyway, till recently, a good hold. One is the Malacca Straits. The Malacca Straits is a very narrow piece of ocean between Sumatra and Malaysia. And it's a critical junction that connects the Pacific with the Indian Ocean. So if that's a choke point, and the British developed it a long time back, 150 years ago, from the East India Company, actually. There was somebody from Calcutta who came up with the idea of making that a choke point. And that choke point enabled the British Empire and the East India Company to have a stranglehold on the Pacific trade towards Asia and into the Indian Ocean. The other choke point is, of course, the Persian Gulf. And there, the US has a fairly good understanding with Oman and Qatar and other players. They also have the Diego Garcia naval base. So those are the positives of that, from a water maritime control point of view. The other thing is that for a long time, the US and India have been soft friends, or really not a reliable relationship for almost the last 60, 70 years. And it is a very good positive move that, because of the rise of China and the issues in the AFPAC area, the US and India are coalescing into a much more robust relationship. Third thing positive is many of these ports that the Chinese are acquiring all over these in Asia and Africa and other places, they're not all suitable for military ships, especially aircraft carriers and large ships. Many of them have to be desilted. From what I heard from other presentations by other naval folks, it is not possible for Gadar, for example, to become a Chinese naval base because there's a lot of silt and sand, and it will not support the movement of big ships into the area. So that's another positive. Now, on the negatives, I'm going to mention a few things. First of all, the Quad is conceptually sound, but India is the only non-treaty partner in the Quad. Japan, Australia, and United States are already treaty partners. And India is a non-treaty partner. And so that does create like a second-tier relationship, which is a bit of a risk because when push comes to shove, one has to wonder whether the trust level is there enough in a real crisis or in a real conflict. With the treaty partners, they are much more obligated to follow up, although in the recent behavior of the US and Afghanistan, they even messed up the NATO folks. So there's no guarantees, but India is the only non-treaty partner in the Quad. On the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal, I just want to highlight that it's not something that's going to happen in the near term. The nuclear technology takes many decades to mature and be used. Australia has no expertise in nuclear. Australia has no nuclear civilian plants. They have, I think, 1 or 2 university small research reactors. That's about it. And their focus in the past has been on radiation from medical procedures and that sort of thing. So for Australia to become a mature, reliable nuclear partner and deploy the submarines, etc., it's probably a 20-year project. They have to develop the culture, they have to develop the technical expertise, they have to develop the protocols of safety. All this is going to take a long time. So one should not bank on that as a near-term solution. It is definitely a right move, although I think the US did complicate it by not communicating properly with France and NATO. It became strictly a British-American enterprise, and I think that was not a good thing from an alliance point of view. So my problem is that China is really developing a stranglehold on Southeast Asia. If you look at Myanmar and Thailand and particularly Indonesia, Malaysia, they were all supplied Chinese vaccines. The Chinese are there for them. The infrastructure is being built by the Chinese in many cases. All this means that the Malacca Strait strategy could be weakened a little bit. So we'll have to figure out long-term how to strengthen the all the Quad members should have very strong relationships with Malaysia and Indonesia in particular, and Thailand. And although they have good relations, the Chinese are trying to drive a wedge in there. So those are the big picture comments I wanted to make. I think Admiral Kulchestra's presentation was masterful, and the very big picture with all the military logistics and other complications. And I would like to make this a discussion group and look forward to questions on any of the things I made, or I might comment on something that Admiral Kulchestra made. So with that, I would like to open up, turn it back to you, sir, for Q&A. I think you're muted.
Okay. So the chat function is open for everyone to send. Please do not interrupt. Kindly send your questions through chat function. I have a number of questions from one of our viewers, but I would appreciate if other people also send their questions, so I don't have to rely on just one person for sending their questions. But I'm going to start. My friend Dr. Arun Agrawal, based in New York, has a series of questions. So I will start with the first question. And either of the panelists may answer, or both may answer. The first question is, do you think that the US is working with India on militarizing the Quad, or it is just a talk? If not, why not? Vijay, you are muted. Vijay, please unmute yourself. You're still muted, sir.
Okay. No, I was going to say that the Quad has done some military exercises in the Indo-Pacific region, in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, and other parts of the world. So I think there is some degree of coordination and military exercise practice and smoothening of protocols of communications and things like that. But I think the Admiral will be in a better place to answer that. You know, the other thing I have to remind you is that so far I'm not sure, other than some friendship visits, I don't think the American Navy has any kind of infrastructure in India to be supported, where India can support them. Because, you know, these ships are very complicated machines, and they do need a lot of port infrastructure and procedures and coordination. And I don't believe India has provided such access to American ships, except on friendly visits on occasionally. But in a war environment, the kind of support it would need on the ports would be much more difficult. But the US does have a lot of support in Oman and Abu Dhabi, in Dubai and in Qatar, as well as Diego Garcia. They have their own base. So I believe that they have adequate in the Indian Ocean, but not vis-a-vis India. I think India has been, in the past, has been skittish about coordinating very tightly on the Navy, except for participating in exercises. But the Admiral might have a different perspective.
Admiral Kulshrestha.
Sir, I agree with Mr. Nilekani. The Quad exists in between the non-military and the military status. Officially, Quad is not a military alliance. It is trying to contain China through all other means possible, like economic means, welfare means, and other things. But on the sidelines, we do have the Malabar exercises and other bilateral exercises with all the Quad members, which are also military exercises. And as Mr. Nilekani has pointed out, I do not think that India will agree for basing of US ships in any of the Indian ports as of now. Though they would like a foothold in Andamans, which is the nearest to Malacca Straits, but I don't think a base would be possible at that place.
So essentially, quadrilateral security dialogue is just a security dialogue. It is not a military alliance at this point in time. It's not a security pact. The terms that have been thrown around is Quad going to be an Asian NATO? Just hyperbole. There is no Asian NATO. The only thing that came equivalent to was SEATO in 50s, 60s, and early 70s. And SEATO was disbanded in 1976 because of lack of interest by some of the member states. So it was disbanded. Quad does not purport to be a 21st century avatar of SEATO. So yes, there is security dialogue, there are some friendly naval exercises, but Quad is not a military alliance, and it is certainly not an alliance against a particular nation. Whether you look at Quad 1.0, Quad 2.0, and now Quad 3.0, it does not claim in any way to be targeted against any specific country, so we need to keep that in mind. So that is my editorial comment. I'll go on to the next question, which is again from Dr. Arun Agrawal. And the question is, what can India do as a standalone to establish its maritime dominance in the Indian Ocean, or it is completely dependent on the US? Let's start with Admiral Kulshrestha.
Sir, as far as the Indian Ocean per se is concerned, we are the dominant maritime power which is stationed in the area. No other power is stationed here except US based in Diego Garcia or Oman or something. But we are the resident power in the area. And all the HADR, that is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and all other functions, anti-piracy and other things, we are carrying out. So we don't claim to be the IOR power per se, but we are the existing power in the area.
I think, Mr. Nilekani, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree completely with the Admiral. We are probably the preeminent power there, but we have to also look at India's naval power versus China's naval power. And I think it's a complete mismatch. I've not really gone deep into Jane's or anything like that to get the statistics, but I think the number of nuclear submarines, the nuclear aircraft carrier, they're building one a year, the number of ships, the number of destroyers, if you take all that into account, they really vastly overpower us. But the good news is that they can't really move that navy into the Indian Ocean very easily because of the Malacca Straits. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I should mention is the historical perspective. India has not taken a great interest in its maritime territory in its history, in recent history. The last major Indian civilization that had a world-class blue water capacity was the Cholas in Tamil Nadu. They had ships that went and actually almost colonized Sri Lanka, went to Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, and all that, Vietnam. So they had a world-class blue water navy in the 10th and 11th century. After that, none of the Indian kings or even the Muslim sheikhs or the Mughals, nobody had a navy. They never took an interest in the sea. And the real involvement with the sea happened again. Shivaji had a minor navy that harassed European ships in the ports, but it was not a blue water navy. So I think we don't have a long tradition of using our maritime capacity. Although the Indian Navy itself, since the Second World War, etc., has had a stellar experience, and the Indian Navy has been growing. But when you compare it with the Chinese Navy, it's quite overwhelming, I think. But I would let the Admiral comment on that.
I am going to jump in here. Just excuse me, Admiral Kulshrestha. Since the comment was made about Shivaji's this thing, following Shivaji, I think there were a couple of admirals, Tulaji Angre and Kanoji Angre,
Right.
with the French and Portuguese, ships, etc. India historically had naval presence in all over Southeast Asia. That is how Indian culture went into Southeast Asia as east as Philippines, and that was through naval power.
But that was through the Cholas, though.
Cholas, yes, and even probably prior to Cholas because we don't have historical records, but the artifacts that are available, they point to that. Second point I will make is that in post-independence India, let's be very frank, the Navy has been Cinderella of Indian armed forces. Navy always had a very, very little budgetary allocation. Armed forces had a very puny budget in maybe first 30 years of independent India's existence, specifically under the first prime minister. We are not going to go into that. So there are historical reasons. China at this point in time has world's largest navy, which has around 386 naval ships of various heights. I think what is not generally appreciated, that China's interest in Indian Ocean was there around 2005 and 2006. At that time, China sent an armada of 3 ships in Indian Ocean, ostensibly to combat the Somali pirates. And from that, Chinese involvement in Indian Ocean continued to increase over a period of time. At one point in time, they had a post in Seychelles. It was not called a naval base, it was called a recuperation and rejuvenation post where the Chinese ship could actually stop. And for the last 3 years, they have a naval base actually in Djibouti. So China is consistently increasing its naval presence in Indian Ocean. In China, actually the policy before even One Belt, One Road, the policy of strings of pulse of a string, envisage actually civilian and dual use of these ports in the neighborhood, where they started investing, because once you have commercial interest, military interest come later on. And in 2008, 2009, but then strongman of China, Hu Jintao, had publicly, exhorted PLA and Plan, which is PLA Navy, to be prepared for maritime warfare. And what was decreed at that point in time, that all the vehicles, all the boats, all the ships in China will be dual purpose. So the merchant ships were retrofitted at that point in time. So China has a lot of spare capacity because they are fishing trawlers, they are fishing boats, they are merchant marine vessels. They are all now repurposed for dual use. So there is a deceptive picture here, like everything about China. Their aircraft carrier program, the Leonin aircraft carrier, was purchased from Ukraine in 1999 by a Chinese businessman, ostensibly to start a floating casino. So China has been going systematically to increase its naval power, and the goal of Plan is to have what is called TSN, 1,000 ships navy. Right now they have only 386 naval ships, but they intend to continue to have naval acquisitions and increase the power of their navy. So we have a lot of force asymmetry. India is a dominant power in the Indian Ocean, but I would qualify that India is at this point not a net security provider in Indian Ocean. In the military terms, so yes, we have our regional dominance, but we are not a net security provider. The good thing is that we have a permanent aircraft carrier in Andaman Nicobar, and that will come to our advantage. I will leave now to Admiral Kulshrestha to give his comments.
Sir, I agree with all the comments made by you and Mr. Vijay Nilekani. I have only 2 points. One is when we consider and compare the strengths uh, of Chinese war-making machine at Navy and our war-making machine in the maritime zone, we also should consider who is our threat. Our threat in Indian Ocean is minimal. There is no threat to us in the Indian Ocean from anybody. However, if you look at the Chinese coastline, the complete coastline from Japan to Taiwan, they are hemmed in. And there are so many US bases, South Korea, Vietnam, Subic Bay, Thailand, so they cannot deploy all those 386 ships to come to Indian Ocean region. They cannot leave their main area of threat open and wide. So whatever will come to Indian Ocean would be a very small fraction of the total strength of the Chinese Navy. On the same lines, if you ask whether the complete force of Indian Navy can move to South China Sea, I will say it is just not possible. Indian Navy has got enough problems to handle here by even if a few submarines from China come and they can really disrupt our supply lines or slocks as we call. The main area of concern is Djibouti for us because Djibouti has been allocated a portion of the strategic rocket forces of China, which implies that nuclear submarines or a function of the triad will be based in Djibouti or at least will be visiting there. With that, the Pakistani ports of Gwadar, Jiwani, Karachi, and now possibly Chabihar, I have no idea what is happening in Iran. They have got a stranglehold on our energy jugular vein. So our Navy will be deployed on this area much more to ensure the supplies keep coming to India. So for both the powers, their complete forces cannot be deployed in each other's areas. That is one part. Now, I am also hearing that USA, I don't know how far it's true, USA is going to position one of the aircraft carriers in the Arabian Sea. Now that changes the dynamics. That will take a lot of load off our backs. Because the aircraft carrier is not just one ship. It comprises of roughly 35 ships.
Yes.
So that is a huge component. And US aircraft carriers are not like Chinese or Indian or Japanese converted helicopter carriers. They are huge in every way. And they are nuclear power. So if that happens, we'll be very happy. And I hope it takes place.
Next
That is one
question.
point. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Now, other thing is that when the Navy was developed in the times of Admiral Mahan, the Navy was a protection force for the merchant marine. Now, nations which have forgotten the merchant marine and concentrated on the Navy are not going to sustain their Navy. Because what will it sustain on? We are not a hegemon. We don't go and capture areas. We are just sitting. So our policy of keeping Navy slightly lower in the degree of budget allocation is not that wrong. That is my point of view. We need to spend much more money on the land borders currently and the Air Force as compared to the Navy where there is no direct imminent threat. That's all.
And from that, I will take on to the next question, which is very pertinent, and it's from Mr. Tulsi Tauri from Mumbai, India. And that question is, which location is most preferred by China to initiate an attack? Taiwan, Ladakh, or any other naval point?
Sir, attack on whom?
I think he has not specified, but I think
Sir,
it is
Ladakh is a land border.
Yeah.
Taiwan is a dispute between those two countries where US is directly involved. So India doesn't come into picture in Taiwan. So in my personal view, China will keep fingering us on the Ladakh border without initiating a war, at least till the time Taiwan problem is resolved.
I'm going to take the next question from Cleo.
Dr. Adityan,
Yeah.
can I elaborate my question?
Okay. Can we come back to it?
Yeah.
Next one, I think Cleo left. I don't know whether she left, but this is a question. Oh, hi. Admiral, given the potential departure of the 5 Micronesian countries, Palau, FSM, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and Nauru from the Pacific Island Forum, and the fact that 3 have compacts of free association with US facilitating bases, and that Guam and the Marinas are also in the Micronesian region, would it make sense to prioritize the Micronesian region as second, third island chain priority region for exercises, logistics, and bases? Admiral Kulshrestha, please unmute yourself. Yeah.
I agree completely with Cleo on this aspect, and I have talked about this island chains in my presentation also. We need to find the nodes where we can support forces of the Quad and build them up, but it is going to take time. Micronesia is a very important area for the Quad because as of now, in my personal opinion, the first island chain is already well defended by the Chinese. So our hope is second and third island chains where we can simply find some bases. If the Chinese develop this Dongfeng 21D, I can assure you no aircraft carrier will venture within say 2000 kilometers of the Chinese maritime border. No country can afford to have its aircraft carriers sunk. So it will stay out of that area unless we find some, permanent aircraft carriers. Taiwan was one such place which is likely to go anywhere. And we'll have to build some other places. There are airstrips available in the island chains which were used during World War II. How far they are, suitable now, that all has to be worked out. There is a big logistic planning which needs to be done. Capability assessments need to be done. That point I've been making. Quad has made no study, to my knowledge, of open source information as to the military capabilities it will need in case Quad has to confront the Chinese in the South China Sea. There is no such study available. And how will the countries cope up with? Which country will provide what type of forces? There is no data available on this. So Quad at present is trying to only control and contain China through other means other than war. So that appears to be the logic at the moment, and maybe they are, asking for time to build up the basis.
Vijay?
I have traveled to Micronesia, and one subtle advantage that Quad would have there is through Australia. Australia has a lot of influence in Micronesia. They provide them a lot of economic aid and a lot of development aid and a lot of political relationships. So I think Australia being part of the Quad does give us give the Quad an entry into Micronesia. But it's also true that China has been bribing people there because they also want the United Nations votes. See, every time China does something, they have a multifaceted approach. And what they want to do is basically get small countries in Caribbean and Micronesia and places like that and get their votes in the United Nations so it looks like a very lopsided vote. In addition to any other military objectives they might have. But Australia does have a lot of influence in Micronesia.
There's a specific question by Mr. Tulsi Tauri about Malaysia's relationship with China and how Malaysia will sort of, facilitate China in Malacca Strait. Admiral Kulshrestha, do you have any opinion on that?
Sir, yeah, I've got one point. Choking of Malacca Strait. It is a very good idea, it seems very nice that we can choke all the supplies to China by choking the Malacca Strait. Of course, we have a bypass which is longer. Lombok and Sunda straits can be used. But kindly remember that the merchant ships today are not flying the flag of the country to which they are taking the goods.
Yeah.
And oil, which is the most important component of this, is a frangible item, meaning thereby it gets traded en route. So it may start from Saudi for a particular country, but along the way it may get traded for some other country. Now, once we put a choke on Malacca Strait, how are we going to find out which country is the recipient of the supplies? It's a very difficult task. It will antagonize all the countries east of Malacca Strait if we put a choke there, because all the other countries are receiving their supplies, including United States, from the energy slots and other slots which are going through that area. So a completely different strategy would have to be put in place, wherein another study is required, which Cleo knows I have been arguing that we should at least do a study of the energy needs in case Malacca Strait is choked. How will the routing be done? And for that we have to pre-plan, create strategic oil reserves and other supplies. Now that part is not put in place till now.
Yeah,
So,
the one other point I would make is that the Malacca Straits is also the point for supplying oil to China. Most of China's oil currently comes through the Persian Gulf and Malacca Straits. And it would, but the Chinese are trying to build a pipeline between China and Iran and the Middle East, part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And if they're successful in doing that, and that's one of the reasons that Afghanistan becomes a player, because they're in the middle there. So it is a very complex situation. And if the Chinese are successful in building a pipeline, it really reduces their vulnerability, but it increases the vulnerability for all the Southeast Asian and Pacific countries. So that's just a comment I wanted to make.
There are a
sir, a
number
small
of
point, if I may comment. There are studies available of the size and diameter of the pipelines being laid by China through Gwadar and through other places, including the one, if at all, will be put through Chabar during the $400 billion investment there. They cannot meet the need of China in the next 10 years. Those capacities are too small. So this Malacca Strait will remain relevant at least for next 10 to 20 years, if not more. The haulage through the ships is much more than what can ever be done through those pipelines.
So we are actually exceeding our time. There are a number of questions there in the chat function. I will just ask one question that is from Dr. Agrawal, and that is about the economic impact of recent happenings, what impact it will have on China's further ascent, because certain things have happened, in last US administration, current US administration, also COVID's impact on the economy. So the question being asked is this economic impact on China will curtail China's further ascent or not? Vijay?
My personal view is that China's rise is not a guaranteed rise. It's not a straight line extrapolation. China has a lot of issues, everything from their population demographics to their ability to rub people the wrong way and alienate much of the world. There's a lot of things that China's rise is not a guaranteed thing. It does look pretty scary right now. It is a very, very troubling thing, but it's not a guaranteed thing. There are many economists at American Enterprise Institute and other places that feel that China will become its worst enemy because modern technology, etc., needs transparency, needs, for example, the Chinese currency will never become the global currency. Nobody would trust the Bank of China because it's all a very secretive, closed door thing. So the US dollar is going to stay the global currency regardless of how much China grows. And China's growth is not a guarantee. It could collapse on its own internal contradictions, because ultimately transparency and people's happiness and ability to express themselves and all are very important qualities, and China doesn't have it. In fact, if anything, they've made it really bad in the last, since Xi came on the top. That's my view. So it's not a guarantee that it's not a straight line extrapolation.
Admiral, your point of view?
Sir, I am not an expert on economics at all. The defense people have hardly anything to do with economics. But nonetheless, I wish that its economy collapses on its own without any wars being fought.
So I'll just chime in and then we will close because we are way over the time. So one issue is 4-1 problem of China. China is an aging society that has not yet experienced prosperity. It is having aging population. They have changed the norms from 1 child to 2 child and 3 child now, but they'll take at least 1 generation, 2 generation before they have a younger workforce. So they are lacking in actually younger workforce. That is one issue with China. Second issue is debt to GDP ratio. That's very high. Chinese economy is heavily borrowed economy by the state sector, the provincial level. They have borrowed very heavily, so you are seeing the consequences. There's an internal turmoil going on in China. On top of what Vijay has mentioned, there seems to be a turmoil going on between CCP and PLA. And there's an internal factions between the Jiang Zemin faction and Communist League, Youth League faction and Xi Jinping's own thing. So far, Xi Jinping has been able to control all the dissidents. But once 2022 passes, I will predict that there will be more internal strife in the CCP because people who expected Xi to leave after 2 terms, and since he is planning not to leave, they will not sit so quiet. China has a history of bloody internecine warfare in the Communist Party, and we don't have to go into that history. So I will chime in with what Vijay has said, that China's economic ascent is not guaranteed. China may say that rest of the world is ganging up against itself, but China's economic downfall would be its own doing. So we should not be so concerned at this point in time because Chinese economy is already declining. The reimposition of the Maoist rules will have its impact as well. And of course, lack of transparency. Nobody has trust. China was able to prosper in last 20 years because of certain amount of openness. With 9 years of Xi Jinping, that openness is gone, and there is no expectation that there will be any transparency. People are already shying away from China. So let's not hedge too much on China's continued economic rise. It has been a wonderful discussion, very, brilliant panelists, very educated discussion, but, all good things have to come to an end. So I have to close it because we are way above our time. I thank all the people, audience and our panelists. I really am impressed with certain people from India, 5:30 a.m. in the morning, including Admiral Kulshrestha. I'm very, very thankful. And we hope that we'll continue to have your ongoing participation in Council for Strategic Affairs activities. So my thanks to all the panelists as well as audience. And with this, we close our roundtable discussion on AUKUS, Quad, and Indo-Pacific Maritime.
Thank you.
I'll make one just last announcement. Our distinguished speaker series for the month of October would be on Saturday, October 30th, 10 a.m. Eastern Day Time. And the distinguished speaker will be yet again another Admiral Pradeep Chauhan. who will be speaking on rule-based order and Indo-Pacific maritime security. So we are concentrating very heavily on Indo-Pacific maritime security. Those of you who have some time on a Saturday morning, you are more than welcome to join and enrich the discussion. And thank you everyone indeed. We take your permission to close. Namaste.